So in class today, we were discussing the effects of the French Indian War on the British colonies, and we're going to continue doing that now with the event known as Pontiac's Rebellion. So since the Native Americans had fought alongside the French during the French and Indian War, they were obviously not happy when England won over the French. And they're very fearful as the British kind of start to move west into the Ohio River Valley where Native Americans have been living this whole time. So one Native American chief in particular, his name is Pontiac, as pictured on the screen. He is going to lead a rebellion against the British. Alongside several tribes, the Native Americans are able to capture several military posts in the western portions of the colonies. And they actually kill several hundred settlers as well. Now the British are able to defeat the natives in this rebellion eventually, and a peace settlement is negotiated between the Native American chief and the British leadership. So here's the kind of truce that they came to, or the agreement they came to. The Native Americans did agree to accept that Britain now had claim over the territory west of the, Britain now had claim over the territory east of the Mississippi River in the Ohio River Valley. So the natives do acknowledge that officially. But in exchange for that public acknowledgement, the new monarch of England, who is King George III, he is going to issue something called the Proclamation Line, officially called the Proclamation Line of 1763. What it did was it created this boundary line along the Appalachian Mountains, and it set a boundary to where the settlers, the colonists of England that lived in the colonies, were not allowed to settle west of those mountains. So all the British colonists are not allowed to settle west of that proclamation line, and I have that line drawn out on the screen, which is the boundary of the Appalachian Mountains. Now this makes the colonists pretty angry. You know, they just fought and won the French and Indian War. They've gained all this territory, and they're not being allowed to go and cultivate and settle this land. England's just happy to keep it in England's name, but to prevent the settlers from settling there, what's the point? But the reason he did this was to kind of prevent future conflict with the natives, but obviously the colonists become very angry with the king because they would like to settle that land. So now we're going to look at the legacy of the French and Indian War as it kind of leads to the Revolution. So I have the 4 points on the screen here. Several pieces of the post-French and Indian War era kind of add to this overall legacy that's leading us into conflict with England. So the first piece of the legacy is that, you know, during the war, British and colonial troops really did not get along. You know, they're really two different groups, and England had sent over British military and British officials from England to fight in the colonies and fight in North America during this war. And even though they're both considered English, they're not really the same. They kind of dress differently, and they have just different cultures now, kind of growing up, you know, different parts of the world. The Americans kind of look at the British as being snobby, and the British look at the Americans as being inferior. So they just don't have a good rapport with each other. The second issue is that the colonists are not obeying the Navigation Acts. Now we saw this when we introduced the idea of the Molasses Act, in which the colonists would have to pay a higher price for French imported sugar, we're going to see some colonies just forego and not obey those laws and just kind of start smuggling in sugar and paying the price they want to pay. And they get away with it during the period of salutary neglect, but during the war, you have these large increased numbers of British soldiers in the American colonies witnessing the colonists smuggle in goods, and so they're going to kind of be the tattletales and go tell the king what's going on. Now, the third factor is that King George is going to leave a large army, kind of, he's calling it a peacetime army, but he leaves a lot of his British officers behind after the French and Indian War to remain in the colonies. And this really makes the colonists feel that their king doesn't trust them. And that Britain is kind of just making a statement saying, you know, we're going to keep an eye on you. And they don't like that. And the most significant factor is the fact that wars cost money. And since England has fought, even though they've won this expensive war and gotten to claim land, they're still in a large amount of debt after the war is over, because wars cost money. Okay, and so you don't gain money in a war. They've lost money even though they've won. England has. So the way you increase revenue is through taxes, and that should kind of be you connecting the dots, or, you know, putting the pieces of the puzzle together. Because the way that England is gonna make some of this money back is charging, passing on taxes and collecting money. And they're gonna start by doing it only in England first, like they're gonna tax their own English citizens in England back home. But eventually they're gonna start passing on some of these taxes on the colonies themselves to be collected, since the war was fought, on colonial soil. We will end by just introducing the first of these major taxes. There is a new Prime Minister of Britain. His name is George Grenville, as spelled out on the Screencast video. And he has decided that it is time to begin to tax the colonists to help pay for the cost of that war, the French and Indian War. After all, the war was fought, in order to keep land in the colonies, and so the colonists should be willing to pay taxes to England, since the war was fought to kind of keep their land. You recall, they cannot settle the land they've gained, but still. And he also wants the smuggling that he's hearing about with especially the French sugar, to stop. So this act is actually going to have something to do with the Molasses Act as well. He is going to propose and have Parliament pass what becomes known as the Sugar Act. Now, the Sugar Act, and pay attention to this because this gets confusing, the Sugar Act actually reduced the tariff that was placed on French molasses with the Molasses Act. So it reduced that initial tariff that the Molasses Act established in hopes that the colonists would be willing to pay a reduced fine, or a reduced price, rather than risk the consequence. He also kind of ups the consequence if you do get caught smuggling. So essentially he's trying to prevent smuggling, so it actually isn't a brand new tax, it's a lowered tax. But the colonial merchants kind of complained they had been cheating the system the whole time by smuggling in the sugar anyway. And so it is going to hurt them. Granted, they're not playing by the rules, so maybe they need to start, playing by the rules, and then it would be better for them. But they're still making a point saying this does hurt us. We shouldn't have to pay any higher price because of a tariff. But the biggest issue the colonists have with this Sugar Act is that they feel it's unconstitutional, since the colonies are not represented in Parliament. They feel that Parliament has no right to tax the colonies when the colonies themselves are not represented in Parliament, which then births the famous battle cry, no taxation without representation. It's more than just you're taxing us, it's the fact you're taxing us and we're not even getting to vote on it. And with that, we will stop. So please be sure to write down any questions, and we'll discuss tomorrow. And please, please do not forget right now to go and study your 13 colonies on a map. Okay, y'all have a good night.